Your soulmate is in love with someone else, and you didn't see it coming. Stay with me and don't rush past this, because what you're about to read isn't meant to shock you for the sake of drama. It's meant to speak to the quiet confusion you've been carrying without fully naming it. That strange feeling you couldn't explain. That shift you sensed but didn't want to believe. The way something felt off even when nothing obvious had happened yet. This is about that moment when truth arrives softly, not loudly, and changes how you see everything. You didn't see it coming because love rarely announces when it's slipping away. It doesn't always end with arguments or goodbyes. Sometimes it ends in small pauses. In delayed replies. In laughter that doesn't quite reach the eyes anymore. In a presence that feels thinner, like someone is standing next to you but not fully with you. You told yourself it was stress. Timing. Life. You gave the benefit of the doubt because that's what you do when you care. The hardest part isn't that your soulmate fell in love with someone else. The hardest part is that it happened quietly, while you were still holding space, still choosing them, still believing the connection was mutual. You were investing emotionally in something that had already started to drift in another direction, and no one warned you. Not them. Not your intuition, at least not loudly enough. There's a specific kind of pain that comes from being emotionally loyal while someone else is emotionally transitioning. You weren't abandoned suddenly. You were slowly outgrown without being told. And that realization doesn't hit all at once. It arrives in waves. A comment that feels strange. A distance you can't bridge. A moment when you realize you're the only one still trying to protect what used to exist. You may be asking yourself how you missed it. How you didn't notice sooner. How someone who felt like your person could be opening their heart somewhere else without you sensing it clearly. But the truth is, you did sense it. You just didn't trust it. You explained it away because trusting the feeling would have meant accepting something you weren't ready to face. When someone starts falling for another person, their energy changes before their words ever do. They become distracted in a specific way. Not busy, but preoccupied. Their attention drifts. Their emotional availability narrows. Conversations stay surface level even when you try to go deeper. And slowly, without meaning to, they stop meeting you where you are. You didn't imagine the shift. You didn't overthink it. You weren't being insecure. You were responding to subtle emotional cues that your heart picked up long before your mind could make sense of them. But because there was no clear betrayal, no obvious wrongdoing, you told yourself to be patient. To be understanding. To not jump to conclusions. And in that patience, you stayed while their heart was already leaning somewhere else. It hurts in a way that's difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. Because you can't point to one moment and say, this is when everything changed. There's no clear line. Just a gradual realization that the connection you thought was exclusive no longer is. That the emotional intimacy you believed was sacred had quietly been redirected. What makes it even heavier is that they may not have meant to hurt you. They didn't wake up one day and decide to replace you. Feelings don't work like that. They often grow in the spaces where something is missing. In conversations that feel easy. In moments of understanding that happen unexpectedly. And before they realized it themselves, their heart had started attaching elsewhere. But intent doesn't erase impact. You're allowed to grieve this even if nothing was officially ended yet. You're allowed to feel hurt even if no rules were technically broken. Emotional truth matters just as much as factual truth. And emotionally, something was taken from you without your consent, the shared understanding that you were choosing each other. You might be replaying old conversations now, looking for signs. Rereading messages. Remembering moments that felt slightly off. And in hindsight, they make more sense. The hesitation. The lack of follow-up. The way enthusiasm faded but never fully disappeared. That's the confusing part. They didn't pull away completely. They just didn't lean in anymore. That in-between space is where hope survives longer than it should. It's also where you start questioning yourself. Wondering if you were too much. Or not enough. If you asked for clarity too soon or waited too long. If you should have spoken up earlier or stayed quiet. This self-questioning is natural, but it's not fair to you. Because you were responding to the information you had at the time, and you responded with care. The truth you're facing now isn't just about them loving someone else. It's about realizing that you were emotionally present in a connection that had already begun to change shape without your knowledge. And that realization forces you to confront a painful imbalance. You were holding something that the other person had already loosened their grip on. This doesn't mean you were foolish. It means you were faithful to what you believed was real. There's also a quiet fear underneath all of this. The fear that you were replaceable. That what you shared wasn't as unique as you thought. That someone else could step into a space you believed belonged to you. That fear cuts deep because it touches your sense of worth, not just your sense of loss. But here's what matters, and this is important to hear slowly. Their ability to fall for someone else does not diminish the reality of what you shared. It only reveals where they were emotionally at the time. Love doesn't always end because it wasn't real. Sometimes it ends because one person didn't know how to stay present once something new appeared. You didn't lose because you weren't enough. You lost because you were committed to something that required two people to protect it, and only one of you was still doing that work. There's a moment coming, if it hasn't arrived already, when you'll stop asking what they're feeling now and start asking what you need. That shift is subtle but powerful. It's the moment you realize that staying emotionally available to someone who is emotionally invested elsewhere is costing you more than it's giving you. This part hurts because letting go doesn't mean the love disappears immediately. It means you're choosing not to abandon yourself any longer. It means you're acknowledging that your heart deserves reciprocity, not ambiguity. You may still care about them. You may still wish things were different. You may still feel the pull of what once felt like destiny. All of that can be true while also recognizing that the connection, as it is now, is no longer aligned with you. And alignment matters more than attachment. What you're facing isn't just the end of a belief. It's the beginning of clarity. Painful clarity, yes. But clarity that will eventually steady you. Because once you see the truth, you stop fighting reality. And fighting reality is what drains you the most. This part of the story isn't about revenge or resentment. It's about acceptance. About letting yourself feel the grief without turning it inward as self-blame. About recognizing that loving deeply sometimes means being hurt deeply, and that risk doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. You didn't see it coming because you trusted. Because you believed in consistency. Because you assumed emotional honesty where there was silence. That says something beautiful about you, even if it hurts right now. And this is only the beginning of understanding what this means for you, not just for the connection you thought you had, but for how you choose yourself moving forward. Stay here. This isn't the end of the story. It's the moment before everything becomes clearer. Stay with me through this part 2, because part 2 is where the shock settles into something heavier and more complicated than disbelief. This is where the truth you couldn't look at directly starts sitting beside you, not as a question anymore, but as a reality you have to live with. The initial sting fades just enough for the deeper ache to surface, and that ache is where the real work begins. Once you accept that your soulmate is in love with someone else, your mind starts searching for reasons. Not out of curiosity, but out of survival. You want to understand how it happened, when it happened, and what it says about you. You replay timelines. You compare versions of yourself. You try to pinpoint the exact moment where things could have gone differently, as if clarity could rewind the past. But clarity doesn't rewind. It only reveals. What's hardest to process is that the love didn't vanish before your eyes. It moved quietly. It slipped into another place while you were still emotionally present. And that creates a very specific kind of grief, one where you're mourning something that technically still exists, just not for you anymore. There was no clean ending. No final conversation. Just a slow emotional displacement. You might notice how your thoughts keep drifting toward them even when you try to focus on yourself. You wonder what they're doing now. Whether they feel guilty. Whether they think of you when they're with that other person. These thoughts don't mean you're weak. They mean your heart hasn't caught up to the information your mind already knows. And there's anger too, even if you don't want to admit it. Anger at the unfairness. At the lack of honesty. At the way you were left to piece things together on your own. But that anger often turns inward, because it feels safer to blame yourself than to sit with the idea that someone you trusted didn't protect the connection the way you did. You start asking questions like, was I too available? Did I love too openly? Did I ignore signs because I didn't want to seem controlling or insecure? And slowly, without realizing it, you turn care into a flaw and loyalty into a mistake. That's one of the most painful side effects of this kind of loss. It makes you doubt the very qualities that made you capable of love in the first place. The truth is, when someone begins loving someone else, it's rarely because the person they leave behind lacked something. It's usually because the connection stopped being actively chosen. Love needs maintenance. It needs honesty. It needs two people who are willing to notice when distance begins to form and address it before something else fills the gap. You can't do that work alone. There's also confusion about what you're allowed to feel. Because nothing may have been officially ended, you might feel like you don't have the right to be this hurt. Like you're overreacting. Like you should just accept it quietly and move on. But emotional bonds don't dissolve on technicalities. They dissolve on truth. And the truth is, your heart was invested in something that no longer exists in the way you believed it did. That realization can feel humiliating. You may feel exposed. As if you were standing still while the world moved on around you. But there is nothing embarrassing about being sincere. What hurts is not that you cared, it's that your care wasn't met with the same level of responsibility. You might also find yourself comparing yourself to the other person now. Wondering what they have that you didn't. What made them easier to love? What made your soulmate choose them? Comparison is a natural response, but it's also a trap. Because you're comparing your entire self to a fragment of someone else's story, one you don't fully know. What you don't see is the context. The timing. The emotional state your soulmate was in when that connection formed. You don't see the compromises that may come later. You don't see the ways people often repeat patterns instead of resolving them. All you see is the outcome, and you internalize it as a verdict on your worth. This is where you need to be gentle with yourself. Losing someone to another person feels different from losing them to circumstance or distance. It feels personal, even when it isn't meant to be. It touches your sense of identity. It makes you question whether you were ever truly chosen, or if you were just convenient until something else appeared. But here's something important that doesn't get said enough: being loved at one point doesn't guarantee being chosen forever. And being chosen by someone who is emotionally drifting isn't the same as being truly seen. Love that can be redirected without honesty was never fully anchored, no matter how intense it once felt. There may come moments when you're tempted to confront them. To demand answers. To ask why you weren't enough. Sometimes those conversations bring clarity. Sometimes they bring more confusion. What matters is not whether you get every answer, but whether you stop sacrificing your peace to chase them. Because right now, the real question isn't why they fell in love with someone else. The real question is why you stayed emotionally open in a space that stopped meeting you. And that question isn't about blame. It's about learning. You stayed because you believed in what you felt. Because you trusted the bond. Because you hoped that distance was temporary, not directional. That hope wasn't foolish. It was human. But hope without reciprocity eventually turns into self-abandonment, and that's where the real damage happens. As this truth settles, you may feel a strong urge to detach completely. To shut down. To build walls. To promise yourself you'll never be this open again. That reaction makes sense, but it's not the healing you need. Healing isn't about becoming colder. It's about becoming clearer. Clear about what you deserve. Clear about what you will no longer tolerate. Clear about the difference between someone who cares and someone who chooses. Those distinctions will protect you far more than emotional armor ever could. There's also grief for the future you imagined. The conversations you thought you'd have. The life you pictured unfolding with them. That future didn't disappear overnight, it dissolved gradually, and that makes it harder to let go of. You're not just grieving a person. You're grieving a version of your life that felt possible. Let yourself grieve that fully. Don't rush yourself into acceptance because you think you should be stronger by now. Strength isn't skipping pain. Strength is staying present with it long enough to learn from it. In time, you'll start noticing a shift. Not in how much it hurts, but in how you carry the hurt. It won't feel as sharp. It won't define every thought. You'll begin to have moments where your attention stays with you instead of drifting back to them. Those moments are the beginning of reclaiming your emotional center. You'll also start to recognize something else, that loving someone who couldn't stay emotionally loyal wasn't a failure on your part. It was a mismatch in readiness, not in value. And readiness is something you can't force or fix for someone else. Part 2 is about sitting with this reality without turning it into self-judgment. It's about allowing yourself to feel angry, sad, disappointed, and still worthy. It's about realizing that even though you didn't see it coming, you're not broken for being affected by it. This isn't the end of your capacity to love. It's the end of a chapter where love wasn't protected the way it needed to be. And as painful as that is, it's also the beginning of learning how to protect yourself without losing your heart. Stay here and don't rush away from this moment, because now the story moves inward. What you're dealing with isn't just the fact that your soulmate is in love with someone else. It's what that truth has awakened inside you. The quiet self-examination. The emotional inventory. The realization that this loss didn't just take someone away from you, it changed how you see connection, trust, and yourself. After the shock and the searching for reasons, there comes a heavy stillness. A phase where nothing dramatic is happening on the outside, but everything is shifting internally. This is where you start waking up with the truth sitting in your chest, not as pain sharp enough to knock the air out of you, but as a dull ache that follows you through the day. You function. You smile. You answer messages. But underneath it all, something has cracked open. You may notice that your mind keeps returning to one question: how could something that felt so real end up here? And not just end, but end without warning, without closure, without you being invited into the truth while it was still forming. That question doesn't come from curiosity. It comes from disbelief mixed with grief. Because when you commit emotionally, you don't do it lightly. You don't open your heart halfway. You don't treat connection as disposable. And realizing that someone you felt bonded to could emotionally transition elsewhere without you being part of that process feels like a violation of something unspoken but deeply understood. You trusted the bond. You trusted the shared moments. You trusted the energy between you. And now you're left trying to reconcile that trust with the reality that they were capable of giving their heart somewhere else while you were still holding yours open for them. This is where the pain becomes more existential. It's no longer just about them. It's about what love means if it can change directions without honesty. It's about whether emotional safety is ever guaranteed. It's about whether opening up is worth the risk when the ground can shift without warning. You might find yourself pulling back from people now. Less expressive. More cautious. Not because you want to be closed off, but because you're tired of feeling exposed. Vulnerability feels dangerous when it hasn't been respected. And right now, you're protecting yourself the only way you know how, by retreating inward. There's also a quiet shame that sometimes surfaces, even if you don't talk about it. Shame for not seeing it sooner. Shame for loving someone who didn't stay emotionally loyal. Shame for still caring when you feel like you shouldn't. That shame doesn't belong to you, but it can feel convincing when you're already hurting. Let's be clear about something important. You didn't miss the signs because you were naive. You missed them because you were hopeful. Because you believed in communication over assumption. Because you trusted that if something significant was changing, you would be included in that truth. That's not a flaw. That's integrity. What hurts now is realizing that your integrity wasn't matched with the same level of emotional responsibility. They may not have intended to deceive you. They may have been confused themselves. But confusion doesn't erase the impact of being left out of a transition that directly affected you. There's a moment that often comes during this stage when you start wondering if the connection was ever as deep as you thought. If maybe you overestimated its importance. If maybe you were more invested than they were. That thought can feel devastating, because it threatens to rewrite your memories in a way that makes you feel foolish. But memories don't lie. Feelings don't come from nothing. What you experienced was real, even if it didn't last. The depth you felt says more about your capacity to connect than about their ability to stay. You might also notice anger starting to surface in a clearer way now. Not explosive anger, but a firm, steady resentment toward the unfairness of it all. Toward the emotional imbalance. Toward the fact that you're the one left processing, healing, and restructuring your inner world, while they've redirected their energy elsewhere. That anger isn't something to suppress. It's information. It's telling you that a boundary was crossed, even if it wasn't crossed loudly. It's telling you that you deserve transparency. That you deserve to be treated as someone whose heart mattered in real time, not just in hindsight. At the same time, there's still love there. And that's what makes this so complicated. You're not dealing with a clean break where anger replaces affection. You're dealing with overlap, care and hurt existing at the same time. Missing someone while knowing they're no longer available to you in the way you need. That emotional contradiction is exhausting. This is also where you may feel the urge to reach out one last time. To say something. To ask something. To make sure they understand what this has done to you. Sometimes that urge comes from a desire for justice. Sometimes it comes from a hope that maybe they'll realize what they're losing. Be honest with yourself about which one it is. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be acknowledged. But understand this, acknowledgement from someone who has already emotionally moved on rarely brings the relief you're hoping for. It often opens the wound wider, because it confirms the distance instead of closing it. Right now, the most important acknowledgement needs to come from you. You need to acknowledge that staying emotionally tied to someone who is emotionally invested elsewhere is hurting you. That hoping for a return to what was is preventing you from fully grieving what is. That you cannot heal in the same space where your heart is being quietly sidelined. This is where self-respect begins to matter more than longing. Not in a harsh way. Not in a, cut them off and never look back, way. But in a gentle, firm decision to stop pouring emotional energy into something that can no longer receive it. That decision doesn't mean you stop caring overnight. It means you stop prioritizing their emotional world over your own. It means you begin the slow process of reclaiming your attention, your imagination, and your future. You may feel empty when you do this. Not because you've lost them again, but because you've lost the routine of thinking about them. The habit of checking in emotionally. The familiar pull. That emptiness can be unsettling, but it's also necessary. It's the space where healing begins. In this space, you'll start noticing things about yourself that were muted before. Your needs. Your values. The parts of you that adapted to keep the connection alive. You may realize that you compromised more than you admitted. That you accepted ambiguity longer than you should have. That you minimized your intuition to avoid conflict. This realization isn't meant to make you feel bad. It's meant to make you wiser. Because the pain you're experiencing now isn't just loss. It's growth trying to happen through grief. It's your inner world reorganizing itself around a new truth, that love without mutual choice is not sustainable, no matter how strong the feeling is. You're learning, painfully but powerfully, that being someone's soulmate in your heart doesn't mean they're capable of being yours in action. And that distinction matters. As this understanding deepens, you may feel a quiet strength beginning to form underneath the sadness. A sense that while this hurt you, it didn't break you. That you can survive loving deeply and losing honestly. That your capacity to connect is still intact, even if your trust needs time to rebuild. This stage isn't about closure yet. It's about honesty. About letting yourself see the situation clearly without romanticizing it or vilifying it. About accepting that something meaningful ended in a way that wasn't fair to you, and that you're allowed to step away without needing permission. You didn't see it coming. But now that you see it, you don't have to keep standing in it. This is the slow turning point. The moment where pain stops being just pain and starts becoming direction. And even though it doesn't feel like it yet, this is where you begin moving back toward yourself. Stay here with this, because now the pain you've been carrying starts to change shape. It doesn't disappear, but it stops being only something that hurts you and starts becoming something that teaches you. This is the stage where you're no longer just reacting to the truth, you're beginning to respond to it. And that shift, even though it's quiet, is powerful. By now, the reality has settled in enough that you're not waking up in disbelief anymore. You know what's happening. You know where their heart is. And knowing doesn't make it easier, but it makes it clearer. Clarity is heavy at first, because it takes away hope that was keeping you emotionally afloat. But clarity also takes away confusion, and confusion is what was draining you the most. You may notice that your thoughts are changing. Earlier, everything revolved around them, what they're feeling, what they chose, what you missed. Now, more often than not, your thoughts drift back to you. Not in a selfish way, but in a tired, honest way. You start asking questions like, why did I stay as long as I did? Why did I keep giving when I wasn't being met? Why did I accept emotional uncertainty as something normal? These questions aren't meant to punish you. They're meant to wake you up. You begin to see patterns, not just in them, but in yourself. Patterns of over-understanding. Of making excuses for emotional distance. Of telling yourself that love means patience even when patience starts costing you your self-worth. Seeing these patterns can be uncomfortable, because it forces you to admit that part of your pain didn't come from the loss alone, but from how long you stayed in a space that was slowly hurting you. This is where grief and accountability meet. Not blame, accountability. The kind that says, I didn't deserve this, but I also don't want to repeat it. There's often anger here too, but it's different from before. It's less explosive and more focused. It's anger at the imbalance. At the fact that while you were emotionally present, someone else was emotionally exploring. At the lack of transparency. At the way you were left to figure it out on your own instead of being treated as someone who deserved honesty. That anger is justified. It doesn't make you bitter. It makes you aware. At the same time, you might feel moments of guilt for feeling angry. You might think, they didn't owe me anything, or feelings can't be controlled. And while it's true that feelings can't always be chosen, behavior can. Communication can. Respect can. You weren't asking them to control their feelings, you were asking them to honor the emotional bond you believed you shared. That distinction matters. As this settles, you may also start noticing a subtle detachment happening. Not coldness. Not indifference. Just a loosening. You don't check their social media as often. You don't replay conversations as intensely. When you think of them, it still hurts, but it doesn't knock the breath out of you the way it used to. This detachment can feel scary at first. Like you're losing the last thread that connected you to something meaningful. But what you're actually losing is the habit of self-abandonment. The habit of centering your emotional world around someone who isn't choosing you. And that's not loss. That's progress. You might also feel lonely in a new way. Not the aching loneliness of missing them, but the quiet loneliness of standing with yourself again. When a connection ends, especially one you invested in deeply, there's an emptiness where shared meaning used to live. That emptiness isn't a sign that you're incomplete. It's simply space that hasn't been filled yet. Resist the urge to fill it too quickly. Don't rush into distractions, rebounds, or emotional substitutes just to avoid feeling it. This space is where you recalibrate. Where you relearn what it feels like to belong to yourself without waiting to be chosen by someone else. In this stage, you may also find yourself questioning the idea of soulmates altogether. Wondering how someone who felt so deeply connected to you could end up loving someone else. That doubt is natural. It doesn't mean you were wrong about the connection. It means you're learning that connection alone isn't enough, alignment and commitment matter just as much. A soulmate connection doesn't guarantee permanence. It guarantees impact. And sometimes, the impact is teaching you what you will and won't accept moving forward. You might start remembering moments you ignored. Things that bothered you but you brushed aside. Times when you felt like you were asking for the bare minimum and still felt like it was too much. Looking back, those moments feel louder now. Not because they suddenly appeared, but because you're finally allowing yourself to hear them. This can bring sadness, but it also brings relief. Because it confirms that your intuition was working all along. You weren't crazy. You weren't imagining things. You were sensing misalignment before your mind was ready to accept it. That realization rebuilds trust in yourself. You may also notice that your standards are shifting. Things you once tolerated now feel unacceptable. Emotional vagueness feels draining instead of mysterious. Mixed signals feel disrespectful instead of intriguing. You're no longer interested in chasing clarity, you want it offered freely. This shift doesn't make you harder to love. It makes you harder to lose. There's also a quiet reclaiming of dignity happening here. You stop wanting to explain yourself to them. You stop needing them to understand your pain in order for it to be valid. You realize that whether or not they ever fully grasp what this did to you, you still get to move forward with your truth intact. That's a powerful moment. It's also where forgiveness begins to take a different shape. Not forgiveness as reconciliation, but forgiveness as release. You're not excusing what happened. You're simply choosing not to carry it with you forever. You understand that holding on to resentment keeps you tied to the past in a way that prevents healing. Forgiveness here doesn't mean you would accept them back. It means you're choosing peace over punishment. As you continue moving through this stage, you may feel stronger on some days and deeply tired on others. Healing isn't linear. Some days you'll feel clear and grounded. Other days the grief will resurface unexpectedly. That doesn't mean you're going backward. It means you're human. What matters is that even on the hard days, you're no longer losing yourself in the story. You're standing beside it, observing it, learning from it. You're beginning to understand that love isn't just about feeling deeply, it's about being met. It's about mutual effort, mutual honesty, mutual choice. And no matter how strong your feelings were, you can't build a future alone. That understanding hurts, but it also protects you. This stage is where your heart starts choosing you again, even if it doesn't feel like a celebration yet. It's choosing you by pulling energy back, by asking for better, by refusing to stay in emotional limbo. You didn't see it coming. But now that you see it clearly, you're doing something brave. You're allowing yourself to grow through it instead of shrinking because of it. This is where the story starts turning away from loss and toward self-respect. Quietly. Steadily. And even though the pain hasn't fully lifted yet, you're no longer drowning in it. You're learning how to stand. And that matters more than you realize. Stay with this part, because now the story moves into a deeper, quieter transformation. This is where the pain you've been carrying no longer feels like an open wound, but like a scar that still aches when touched. It's not gone, but it's no longer controlling every thought. And that shift, even though it feels subtle, marks the beginning of something important inside you. By this point, you're no longer shocked by the truth. You know your soulmate is in love with someone else. The words don't knock the wind out of you the way they once did. Instead, they sit there, heavy but familiar. And familiarity, strangely enough, brings a kind of stability. Not comfort, but grounding. You're no longer bracing for impact. You're standing in the aftermath. What you may notice now is a strange emotional contradiction. On one hand, you still miss them. On the other, you're tired of missing someone who isn't choosing you. That internal conflict can feel exhausting. It's like your heart and your self-respect are finally having an honest conversation, and neither one wants to lose. This is where you start realizing how much energy you've spent holding space for someone who was slowly exiting it. How much mental bandwidth went into wondering, waiting, hoping. How many moments of your life were partially occupied by thoughts of them. And when you see that clearly, something shifts. Not in anger, but in resolve. You begin to feel a quiet resistance rise up in you. A resistance to continuing this pattern. A resistance to putting yourself last emotionally. A resistance to loving in ways that require you to shrink, wait, or remain uncertain. This resistance isn't bitterness. It's self-protection finally finding its voice. There's also grief here that goes deeper than before. Not just grief for them, but grief for the version of yourself who waited so patiently. Who tried so hard to understand. Who believed that consistency would eventually be returned. That version of you deserves compassion, not criticism. You were doing the best you could with the information you had and the heart you carried. You may find yourself replaying moments now with less longing and more clarity. Moments where you felt dismissed. Moments where your needs were minimized. Moments where you accepted less than you deserved because you believed love required endurance. Seeing these moments clearly can hurt, but it also validates something important. your pain didn't come from nowhere. This is often the stage where people feel a deep tiredness. Not physical exhaustion, but emotional fatigue. You're tired of analyzing. Tired of processing. Tired of feeling like this chapter has taken up so much space inside you. That tiredness isn't a setback, it's a signal. It's your inner self saying, I'm ready to put this down. And putting it down doesn't mean forgetting. It means refusing to let it define your future. You might also notice that your desire for answers has changed. You don't crave explanations the way you once did. You're no longer obsessed with understanding every detail of how or why they fell in love with someone else. Instead, you're more focused on what this experience revealed about you, your needs, your boundaries, your values. That's a powerful redirection. You start understanding that love without emotional safety isn't something you want to repeat. That chemistry without consistency doesn't sustain you. That connection without clarity eventually becomes painful. These realizations aren't theoretical anymore, they're lived. At this stage, you may also feel moments of unexpected peace. They don't last all day. Sometimes they only last minutes. But they're real. Moments where you're fully present. Where you laugh without thinking of them. Where your mind doesn't automatically drift back. Those moments are proof that your heart is learning how to rest again. At the same time, guilt can creep in. Guilt for feeling okay. Guilt for not hurting as much. Guilt for moving forward while they're still part of your emotional history. That guilt is misplaced. Healing isn't betrayal. Letting go doesn't mean what you felt wasn't real. It means you're choosing not to live in pain indefinitely. You might also notice that your empathy for them has changed. Earlier, you may have been trying to understand their confusion, their feelings, their reasons. Now, you can acknowledge their humanity without excusing their actions. You can see that they may have been lost or unsure, while also recognizing that their choices still hurt you. This balanced view is important. It allows you to release resentment without rewriting reality. You're also beginning to reclaim parts of yourself that were put on hold. Interests you neglected. Routines you adjusted. Pieces of your life that quietly revolved around their availability or emotional state. Reclaiming these parts doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small acts, choosing yourself in little ways, again and again. There's a sense of dignity returning now. Not loud confidence, but quiet self-respect. You stop feeling the urge to prove your worth. You stop wanting to compete with the other person. You stop imagining scenarios where they realize they made a mistake. Those fantasies lose their grip because you no longer need them to validate you. You begin to understand something crucial: being chosen late, reluctantly, or out of loss isn't what you want anymore. You want to be chosen freely, clearly, and fully. And if someone can't offer that, no amount of history or emotion can make it right. This realization can be both empowering and painful. Empowering because it restores your standards. Painful because it confirms that what you hoped for isn't coming from this person. Accepting that truth is one of the hardest emotional tasks there is. You may still have days where the sadness returns unexpectedly. A song. A place. A memory. Those moments don't mean you're failing at healing. They mean your heart remembers. Memory doesn't disappear just because you've grown. It simply becomes less dominant. What's different now is that you don't lose yourself in those moments. You feel them, acknowledge them, and let them pass. You don't spiral. You don't question your worth. You don't collapse into what-ifs. That's progress, even if it doesn't feel dramatic. You're also learning to sit with uncertainty differently. Earlier, uncertainty felt unbearable. Now, you're more comfortable not knowing everything. Not having closure. Not understanding every choice they made. You're realizing that peace doesn't require full comprehension, it requires self-alignment. And slowly, very slowly, you begin to feel ready for something new. Not necessarily a new person, but a new way of relating. A way that doesn't require you to overextend. A way that doesn't ask you to ignore your intuition. A way that feels reciprocal. This readiness doesn't mean you're healed completely. It means you're no longer anchored to the past. You're standing in the present, aware of your wounds but not defined by them. You didn't see this coming. And that still hurts. But what you're seeing now is something else entirely, your own resilience. Your capacity to feel deeply and still choose yourself. Your ability to learn from pain without becoming hardened by it. This stage is about integration. About letting the experience become part of your story without being the whole story. About carrying the lessons forward instead of the weight. You loved honestly. You stayed open. You were real. And even though it didn't end the way you hoped, those qualities are not mistakes. They're strengths that will serve you when the right connection meets you with the same depth. For now, you're doing something incredibly brave. You're letting go without erasing. You're healing without pretending. You're moving forward without denying what mattered. And that, even if it doesn't feel like it yet, is how you begin again. Stay here with this part, because now the story reaches the place where pain no longer asks to be solved. It asks to be honored. This is the stage where you're not trying to fix what happened or make sense of every detail. You're learning how to live honestly with what remains. And what remains is not just loss, it's wisdom, strength, and a deeper understanding of yourself. By now, you've stopped hoping that something will suddenly change. You're no longer waiting for a message that will explain everything or an apology that will make it hurt less. That waiting phase has quietly ended. Not with a dramatic decision, but with emotional exhaustion. You simply reached a point where your heart said, "I can't hold this anymore." That moment matters more than you realize. Because that's the moment you stopped abandoning yourself. Earlier, your energy was split. One part of you was living your life, and another part was constantly turned toward them, wondering, sensing, adjusting. Now, slowly, that split is healing. Your energy is coming back to you. Not all at once. Not neatly. But steadily. You may notice that your days feel different now. Quieter. Less emotionally chaotic. The pain hasn't vanished, but it doesn't spike as often. Instead, there's a dull awareness that comes and goes. And in the spaces between those waves, you're starting to breathe more fully again. This is also where you begin to see how deeply you were shaped by the experience. Not in a broken way, but in a clarifying one. You understand now how easily love can slide into self-sacrifice when you're afraid of losing connection. You see how often you prioritized understanding them over protecting yourself. And instead of judging yourself for that, you feel compassion. Compassion for the version of you who believed patience could fix misalignment. Who believed that if you loved well enough, clarity would eventually arrive. Who believed that silence didn't mean absence. That version of you wasn't weak. They were hopeful. They were loyal. They were acting from their values. The pain came not from those values, but from staying in a situation where those values weren't returned. This is where something powerful happens. You begin separating who you are from what happened to you. Earlier, it all felt tangled together. Their choice felt like a statement about your worth. Their distance felt like proof that you weren't enough. Now, you're starting to untangle that. You see that their ability to love someone else says more about their emotional state than about your value. You see that people don't always leave because something better appears. They leave because they don't know how to stay present when discomfort arises. You see that love requires courage, not just feeling. This understanding doesn't erase the hurt, but it removes the poison from it. You might also notice that your anger has softened. Not because what happened suddenly feels okay, but because you're no longer carrying it like a weapon. Anger served its purpose. It protected your boundaries when sadness couldn't. Now, it's stepping aside, making room for clarity. Clarity looks like this: I don't want a love that makes me doubt myself. Clarity looks like this: I don't want to compete with someone else for emotional space. Clarity looks like this: I don't want to be chosen only after I'm almost gone. These realizations are anchors. They will guide you in ways you won't fully appreciate until later. There's also a subtle grief that emerges here, not for them, but for the illusion you held. The illusion that love alone could carry everything. The illusion that patience would be rewarded. Letting go of that illusion can feel disorienting, because it changes how you approach relationships moving forward. But it also empowers you. Because now you understand that love without reciprocity isn't noble, it's draining. That loyalty without mutual commitment isn't romantic, it's lonely. That hope without action keeps you stuck. And with that understanding, your standards begin to realign. You may notice that you're less tolerant of ambiguity now. Less willing to excuse emotional inconsistency. Less impressed by intensity without follow-through. This isn't bitterness. It's discernment. You've learned the cost of ignoring your inner signals, and you're not interested in paying it again. At this stage, memories don't hurt the same way. They still exist, but they're less charged. You can think of moments you shared without immediately spiraling into what-ifs. You can acknowledge the connection without wanting to return to it. That shift is subtle, but it's significant. It means you're integrating the experience instead of reliving it. You might also find yourself feeling strangely protective of your peace now. You choose rest more often. You say no without over-explaining. You pull back from conversations or situations that drain you emotionally. This isn't avoidance. It's self-respect finding its footing. And yes, there may still be moments when loneliness hits you unexpectedly. Especially during quiet times. Especially when you remember how it felt to feel chosen. That loneliness doesn't mean you made the wrong choice by letting go. It means you're human and connection mattered to you. What's different now is that loneliness no longer sends you running back to something that hurts. You're learning how to sit with discomfort without betraying yourself. This stage is also where your sense of identity starts to feel more grounded. Earlier, so much of your emotional energy was tied to the connection, how it was going, what it meant, where it might lead. Now, you're reconnecting with who you are outside of that story. You rediscover preferences you ignored, needs you minimized, dreams you postponed. This reconnection doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in small, quiet ways, choosing yourself in moments that used to revolve around them. There's also an emerging trust in yourself that wasn't there before. Not the blind trust that assumes everything will work out, but a grounded trust that says, even if things fall apart, I can handle it. I won't lose myself again. I won't stay where I'm not met. That trust is earned. And you earned it the hard way. You may still carry love for them in some form. Love doesn't always disappear just because circumstances change. But it has shifted. It's no longer active. It's no longer directive. It's no longer something that controls your choices. It exists now as memory, not as momentum. And that's healthy. This is also the stage where you stop fantasizing about them realizing what they lost. Not because you don't believe you mattered, but because you no longer need that realization to feel whole. Your worth doesn't hinge on their regret. You start measuring success differently now. Not by whether you're chosen, but by whether you're at peace. Not by intensity, but by consistency. Not by chemistry, but by emotional safety. Those shifts will shape your future in ways you can't yet see. You didn't see this coming. And that truth still stings sometimes. But you're no longer stuck in the moment of impact. You're standing in the aftermath with awareness, dignity, and strength. You loved deeply. You were honest. You stayed open. And even though the outcome hurt, those qualities remain intact. They didn't disappear with the relationship. They belong to you. This part of the journey isn't about closure in the traditional sense. It's about alignment. Your inner world is coming back into alignment with your values, your needs, your boundaries. And when that alignment settles fully, you'll look back on this chapter not as something that broke you, but as something that refined you. You're not there yet. And that's okay. For now, you're learning how to live without carrying what no longer belongs to you. You're learning how to choose yourself without becoming closed. You're learning how to grieve honestly without losing hope. And that learning, slow, painful, and real, is what will lead you into a future where love doesn't require you to disappear. This is not the end of the story. It's the moment where you finally stand on your own ground again, even if your legs are still shaking. And that is enough for now.